Alright, our group presentations over the Bell-Magendie Law. Why the Bell-Magendie Law matters. To really understand why the Bell-Magendie Law matters, we have to step back and think about where psychology came from as a field. Psychology didn't just appear on its own, it developed slowly over centuries, pulling from philosophy, medicine, and physiology. Early thinkers were trying to explain things like how we experience the world around us, how we move, and what connects the mind to the body. The nervous system became one of the most important tools researchers had for answering those questions. The Bell-Magendie Law was a turning point in that process because it gave scientists something concrete, an actual physical structure in the body that they could point to and study instead of just theorizing about behavior from philosophical standpoint. Researchers could now finally examine real nerve pathways and draw meaningful conclusions from that. That shift from speculation to evidence-based thinking is exactly what makes this discovery relevant to the history and systems of psychology. The core idea is this behavior could be studied through physical evidence from the nervous system, and the Bell-Magendie Law was one of the discoveries that made that possible. So, who is Charles Bell? Charles Bell was a Scottish surgeon, teacher, and writer who lived from 1774 to 1842. He's one of the two figures at the center of this discovery, and his contribution came primarily through careful observation and anatomical observation. Bell noticed that the nerve roots coming out of the spinal cord didn't all seem to do the same thing. He suspected that some were involved in sensation and others in movement, which at the time was not even an established idea. He published his thoughts in 1811, but importantly, he did so in a privately printed pamphlet that was only distributed to a small circle of people, not to the broader scientific community. That limited distribution would later become a major point of controversy when questions of credit came up. Now, it's important to note that Bell didn't conduct formal experiments to prove his claim. His insights was more anecdotal and observational in nature. But that doesn't diminish its importance. He was the one who first pointed researchers in the right direction, suggesting that the nervous system has a sensory side and a motor side. So when we talk about Bell, we're talking about early insight and foundational idea that started the conversation, even if it fully didn't close it. Now, François Magendie was a French physiologist who lived from 1783 to 1855. And where Bell offered observation, Magendie offered experimentation. He's best known he's best known for taking the ideas that Bell had proposed and actually putting them to the test in a rigorous scientific way. Magendie conducted direct experiments on animals, specifically puppies, in which he surgically cut and stimulated different spinal nerve roots and observed what actually happened there. What he found was clear. When he cut the posterior roots, the animals lost sensation but could still move. When he cut the anterior roots, the animals could still feel but lost the ability to move. This was a direct reproducible demonstration of the sensory motor distinction, and it was far stronger evidence than anything Bell had ever produced. Magendie's approach represented something broader too. It was part of a growing movement towards experimental physiology as a legitimate scientific discipline. His work showed that you don't just have to observe the body, you can test it, manipulate it, and draw conclusions from that result. So while Bell opened the door with his early insight, Magendie is the one who walked through it and proved the experimental proof that made the Bell-Magendie Law what it is today. So, what are the functions of the spinal nerves? Now let's talk about what the Bell-Magendie law actually tells us about the spinal nerve's work. Because understanding the anatomy here is key to appreciating why the discovery was so significant. The spinal cord doesn't connect to the rest of the body through a single type of nerve. It splits into two distinct sets of roots before those nerves branch out to their own peripheral nervous system. On one side, you have the anterior roots, also called ventral roots, and on the other, you have the posterior roots, also called dorsal roots. These two sets of roots have completely separate jobs. The anterior roots are responsible for motor control, meaning they carry signals from the brain and spinal cord out to the muscles, and when you stimulate them, you get immediate muscle contractions and physical movement. The posterior roots, on the other hand, are dedicated entirely to sensory input. They carry information about things like pain, touch, and temperature from the body back up to the brain. Before the Bell-Magendie law, scientists weren't entirely sure whether these functions were separated or mixed together. This discovery showed that they are completely distinct pathways, almost like two different highways running side by side. That clarity really moved neuroscience away from theoretical guessing and towards precise structural mapping, giving researchers a way to match specific physical structures to specific functions. And that was a massive leap forward. So, conclusion and the legacy of the Bell-Magendie law. Um, so to bring it all together, the Bell-Magendie law established that the spinal cord operates through two distinct and separate pathways. The posterior roots handle sensation, and the anterior roots handle motor control. Charles Bell was the first to publish the idea in 1811 based on anatomical observations, and Francis Magendie proved it experimentally in 1822 through direct testing on animals. The debate over who deserves credit for the discovery is something historians of science have written about extensively, and it's actually a really interesting case study and how scientific credit gets assigned. This situation is a classic example of what's called a multiple in the history of science, where two researchers worked independently in different countries and arrive at the same or very similar conclusions around the same period of time. It happened with Newton and Leibniz over calculus, with Darwin and Wallace over evolution, and it happened over here as well. Bell published first, but the Magendie proved it. So who gets the credit? That's still debated, but what isn't debated is the impact that Bell-Magendie law is one of the early examples of psychology and neuroscience pulling away from pure philosophy and grounding themselves in physical, testable, and repeatable evidences, and that shift laid the groundwork for everything that came after in the development of modern psychology. And here are the references.